look away, Dixieland. In Dixieland, where I was born in early on one frosty morning. Look away, Dixieland. And I wish I was in Dixieland.
Hey everybody, welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we're going to read the second half of Chapter 2 out of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Remember, if you like the episode, hit the like and subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and you'll get notified each time I make a new video. Let's dig in. Sometimes it is noted that even before 1600, when the slave trade had just begun, before Africans were stamped by it, literally and symbolically, the color black was distasteful. In England, before 1600, it meant, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, deeply stained with dirt, soiled, dirty, foul, having dark or deadly purposes, malignant, pertaining to or involving death, deadly, baneful, disastrous, sinister, foul, iniquitous, atrocious, horribly wicked, indicating disgrace, censure, liability to punishment, etc. Well, he just goes on that one, doesn't he? And Elizabethan poetry often used the color white in connection with beauty. It may be that in the absence of any other overriding factor, darkness and blackness associated with night and unknown would take on those meanings. But the presence of another human being is a powerful fact, and the conditions of that presence are crucial in determining whether an initial prejudice against a mere color, divorced from humankind, is turned into brutality and hatred. In spite of such preconceptions about blackness, in spite of special subordination of blacks in the Americas in the 17th century, there is evidence that where whites and blacks found themselves with common problems, common work, common enemy and their master, they behaved toward one another as equals. As one scholar of slavery, Kenneth Stamp, has put it, Negro and white servants of the 17th century were remarkably unconcerned about the visible physical differences. Excuse me. Black and white worked together, fraternized together. The very fact that laws had to be passed after a while to forbid such relations indicates the strength of that tendency. Yes, it does. In 1661, a law was passed in Virginia that in case any English servant shall run away in company of any Negroes, he would have to give special service for extra years to the master of the runaway Negro. In 1691, Virginia provided for the banishment of any white man or woman being free who shall intermarry with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian man or woman bond or free. There is an enormous difference between a feeling of racial strangeness, perhaps fear, and the mass enslavement of millions of black people that took place in the Americas. The transition from one to the other cannot be explained easily by natural tendencies. It is not hard to understand as the outcome of historical conditions. Slavery grew as the plantation system grew. The reason is easily traceable to something other than natural racial repugnance. The number of arriving whites, whether free or indentured servants, under 4 to 7 years contract, was not enough to meet the need of the plantations. By 1700, in Virginia, there were 6,000 slaves, 1/12 of the population. By 1763, there were 170,000 slaves, about half the population. Blacks were easier to enslave than whites or Indians, but they were still not easy to enslave. From the beginning, the imported black men and women resisted their enslavement. Ultimately, their resistance was controlled, and slavery was established for 3 million blacks in the South, still under the most difficult conditions, under pain of mutilation and death. Throughout their 200 years of enslavement in North America, these Afro-Americans continued to rebel. Only occasionally was there an organized insurrection. More often, they showed their refusal to submit by running away. Even more often, they engaged in sabotage, slowdowns, and subtle forms of resistance which asserted, if only to themselves and their brothers and sisters, their dignity as human beings. The refusal began in Africa. One slave trader reported that Negroes were so willful and loath to leave their own country that they had often leaped out of the canoes, boat and ship into the sea, and kept under water till they were drowned. When the very first black slaves were brought into Hispaniola in 1503, the Spanish governor of Hispaniola complained to the Spanish court that fugitive Negro slaves were teaching disobedience to the Indians. In the 1520s and 1530s, that's 1520s and 1530s, there were slave revolts in Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Santa Marta, and what is now Panama. Shortly after those rebellions, the Spanish established a special police for chasing fugitive slaves. A Virginia statute of 1669 referred to the obstinacy of many of them, and in 1680 the Assembly took note of slave meetings under the pretense of feasts and brawls, which they considered of dangerous consequence. In 1687, in the colony's northern neck, a plot was discovered in which slaves planned to kill all the whites in the area and escape during a mass funeral. Gerald Mullen, who studied slave resistance in 18th century Virginia in his work Flight and Rebellion, reports, the available resources on slavery in 18th century Virginia, plantation and county records, the newspaper advertisements for runaways, describe rebellious slaves and few others. The slaves described were lazy and thieving. They feigned illnesses, destroyed crops, stores, tools, and sometimes attacked or killed overseers. They operated black markets and stolen goods. Runaways were defined as various types. They were truants, who usually returned voluntarily, outlaws, and slaves who were actually fugitives, men who visited relatives, went to town to pass as free, or tried to escape slavery completely, either by boarding ships and leaving the colony or banding together in cooperative efforts to establish villages or hideouts in the frontier. The commitment of another type of rebellious slave was total. These men became killers, arsonists, and insurrectionists. Slaves recently from Africa, still holding on to the heritage of their communal society, would run away in groups and try to establish villages of runaways out in the wilderness, on the frontier. Slaves born in America, on the other hand, were more likely to run off alone, and with the skills they had learned on the plantation, try to pass as free men. In the colonial papers of England, a 1729 report from the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia to the British Board of Trade tells how a number of Negroes, about 15, formed a design to withdraw from their master and to fix themselves in the fastness of the neighboring mountains. They had found means to get into their possessions some arms and ammunition, and they took along with them some provisions, their cloths, bedding, and working tools. Though this attempt has happily been defeated, it ought nevertheless to awaken us into some effectual measures. Slavery was immensely profitable to some masters. James Madison told a British visitor shortly after the American Revolution that he could make $257 on every Negro in a year and spend only $12 or $13 on his keep. Another viewpoint was of slave owner Landon Carter, writing about 50 years earlier, complaining that his slaves so neglected their work and were so uncooperative, either cannot work or will not work, that he began to wonder if keeping them was worthwhile. Some historians have painted a picture, based on the infrequency of organized rebellions and the ability of the South to maintain slavery for 200 years, of a slave population made submissive by their condition. With their African heritage destroyed, they were, as Stanley Elkins said, made into Sambos, a society of helpless dependence. Or as another historian, Ulrich Phillips, said, by racial quality submissive. But looking at the totality of slave behavior, at the resistance of everyday life from quiet non-cooperation in work to running away, the picture becomes different. In 1710, warning the Virginia Assembly, Governor Alexander Spotswood said, "Freedom wears a cap which can without a tongue call together all those who long to shake off the fetters of slavery, and as such an insurrection would surely be attended with most dreadful consequences, so I think we cannot be too early in providing against it, both by putting ourselves in a better posture of defense and by making a law to prevent the consultations of those Negroes." Indeed, considering the harshness of punishment for running away, that so many blacks did run away, must be a sign of a powerful rebelliousness. All through the 1700s, the Virginia Slave Code read, "Whereas many times slaves run away and lie hid and lurking in swamps, woods, and other obscure places, killing hogs and committing other injuries to the inhabitants, if the slave does not immediately return, anyone whatsoever may kill or destroy such slaves by such ways and means as he shall think fit. If the slave is apprehended, it shall be lawful for the county court to order such punishment for the said slave, either by dismembering or in any other way as they in their discretion shall think fit, for the reclaiming any such incorrigible slave, and terrifying others from the like practice." Mullen found newspaper advertisements between 1736 and 1801 for 1,138 men runaways and 141 women. One consistent reason for running away was to find members of one's family, showing that despite the attempts of the slave system to destroy family ties by not allowing marriages and by separating families, slaves would face death and mutilation to get together. In Maryland, where slaves were about 1/3 of the population in 1750, slavery had been written into law since the 1660s, and statutes for controlling rebellious slaves were passed. There were cases where slave women killed their masters, sometimes by poisoning them, sometimes by burning tobacco houses in homes. Punishments ranged from whipping and branding to execution. But the trouble continued. In 1742, 7 slaves were put to death for murdering their master. Fear of slave revolt seems to have been a permanent fact of plantation life. William Byrd, a wealthy Virginia slave owner, wrote in 1736, "We have already at least 10,000 men of these descendants of Ham fit to bear arms, and these numbers increase every day, as well by birth as by importation. And in case there should arise a man of desperate fortune, he might with more advantage than Catiline kindle a servile war, and tinge our rivers wide as they are with blood." It was an intricate and powerful system of control that the slave owners developed to maintain their labor supply and their way of life. A system both subtle and crude, involving every device that social orders employ for keeping power and wealth where it is. As Kenneth Stamp puts it, a wise master did not take seriously the belief that Negroes were natural-born slaves. He knew better. He knew that Negroes freshly imported from Africa had to be broken into bondage, that each succeeding generation had to be carefully trained. This was no easy task, for the bondsman rarely submitted willingly. Moreover, he rarely submitted completely. In most cases, there was no end to the need for control, at least not until old age reduced the slaves to a condition of helplessness. The system was psychological and physical at the same time. The slaves were taught discipline, were impressed again and again with the idea of their own inferiority, to know their place, to see blackness as a sign of subordination, to be awed by the power of the master, to merge their interests with the master's, destroying their own individual needs. To accomplish this, there was the discipline of hard labor, the breakup of the slave family, the lulling effects of religion, which sometimes led to great mischief, as one slaveholder reported, the creation of disunity among slaves by separating them into field slaves and more privileged house slaves, and finally, the power of law and the immediate power of the overseer to invoke whipping, burning, mutilation, and death. Dismemberment was provided for in the Virginia Code of 1705. Maryland passed a law in 1723 providing for cutting off the ears of blacks who struck whites, and that for certain serious crimes, slaves should be hanged and the body quartered and exposed. Still rebellions took place. Not many, but enough to create constant fear among white planters. The first large-scale revolt in the North American colonies took place in New York, 1712. In New York, slaves were 10% of the population, the highest proportion in the northern states, where economic conditions usually did not require large numbers of field slaves. About 25 black slaves and 2 Indians set fire to a building, then killed 9 whites who came on the scene. They were captured by soldiers, put on trial, and 21 were executed. The governor's report to England said some were burnt, others were hanged, 1 broke on the wheel, and 1 hung alive in chains in the town. 1 had been burned over a slow fire for 8 to 10 hours. All this to serve notice to other slaves. A letter to London from South Carolina in 1720 reports, "I am now to acquaint you that very lately we have had a very wicked and barbarous plot of the design of the Negroes rising with a design to destroy all the white people in the country, and then to take Charlestown in full body, but it pleased God it was discovered, and many of them taken prisoners, and some burnt, and some hanged, and some banished. Around this time, there were a number of fires in Boston and New Haven, suspected to be the work of Negro slaves. As a result, one Negro was executed in Boston, and the Boston Council ruled that any slaves who on their own gathered in groups of 2 or more were to be punished by whipping for gathering 2 or more. Talk to a friend, you get whipped. At Stono, South Carolina, in 1739, about 20 slaves rebelled, killed 2 warehouse guards, stole guns and gunpowder, and headed south, killing people in their way and burning buildings. They were joined by others until there were perhaps 80 slaves in all, and according to one account of the time, they called out liberty, marched on with colors displayed, and 2 drums beating. The militia found and attacked them. In the ensuing battle, perhaps 50 slaves and 25 whites were killed before the uprising was crushed. Herbert Aptheker, who did detailed research on slave resistance in North America for his book American Negro Slave Revolts, found about 250 instances where a minimum of 10 slaves joined in a revolt or conspiracy. From time to time, whites were involved in the slave resistance. As early as 1663, indentured white servants and black slaves in Gloucester County, Virginia, formed a conspiracy to rebel and gain their freedom. The plot was betrayed and ended with executions. Mullen reports that the newspaper notices of runaways in Virginia often warned ill-disposed whites about harboring fugitives. Sometimes slaves and free men ran off together or cooperated in crimes together. Sometimes black male slaves ran off and joined white women. From time to time, white ship captains and watermen dealt with runaways, perhaps making the slave a part of the crew. In New York in 1741, there were 10,000 whites in the city and 2,000 black slaves. It had been a hard winter, and the poor, slave, and free had suffered greatly. When mysterious fires broke out, blacks and whites were accused of conspiring together. Mass hysteria developed against the accused. After a trial full of lurid accusations by informers and forced confessions, 2 white men and 2 white women were executed, 18 slaves hanged, and 13 slaves burned alive. Only one fear was greater than the fear of black rebellion in the new American colonies. That was the fear that discontented whites would join black slaves to overthrow the existing order. In the early years of slavery, especially before racism as a way of thinking was firmly ingrained, while white indentured servants were often treated as badly as black slaves, there was a possibility of cooperation. As Edmund Morgan sees it, there are hints that the 2 despised groups initially saw each other as sharing the same predicament. It was common, for example, for servants and slaves to run away together, steal hogs together, get drunk together. It was not uncommon for them to make love together. In Bacon's Rebellion, one of the last groups to surrender was a mixed band of 80 Negroes and 20 English servants. As Morgan says, masters, initially at least, perceived slaves in much the same way they had always perceived servants. Shiftless, irresponsible, unfaithful, ungrateful, dishonest. And if free men were with disappointed hopes should make common cause with slaves of desperate hope, the results might be worse than anything Bacon had done, and so measures were taken. about the same time that slave codes involving discipline and punishment were passed by the Virginia Assembly. Virginia's ruling class, having proclaimed that all white men were superior to black, went on to offer their social, but white, inferiors a number of benefits previously denied them. In 1705, a law was passed requiring masters to provide white servants whose indenture time was up with 10 bushels of corn, 30 shillings, and a gun, while women's servants were to get 15 bushels of corn and 40 shillings. Also, the newly freed servants were to get 50 acres of land. Morgan concludes, once the small planter felt less exploited by taxation and began to prosper a little, he became less turbulent, less dangerous, more respectable. He could begin to see his big neighbor not as an extortionist, but as a powerful protector of their common interests. We see now a complex web of historical threads to ensnare blacks for slavery in America. The desperation of starving settlers, the special helplessness of the displaced African, the powerful incentive of profit for slave trader and planter, the temptation of superior status for poor whites, the elaborate controls against escape and rebellion, the legal and social punishment of black and white collaboration. The point is that the elements of this web are historical, not natural. This does not mean that they are easily dismantled. It means only that there is a possibility for something else, under historical conditions not yet realized. And one of these conditions would be the elimination of that class exploitation which has made poor whites desperate for small gifts of status, and has prevented that unity of black and white necessary for joint rebellion and reconstruction. Around 1700, the Virginia House of Burgesses declared, "The Christian servants in this country, for the most part, consists of the worser sort of the people of Europe. And since such numbers of Irish and other nations have been brought in, of which a great many have been soldiers in the late wars, that according to our present circumstances we can hardly govern them, and if they were fitted with arms and had the opportunity of meeting together by musters, we have just reason to fears they may rise upon us." It was a kind of class consciousness, a class fear. There were things happening in early Virginia and in other colonies to warrant it. Thanks for joining me. If you made it this far, you're a trooper. That was a really difficult chapter. Hit the like and subscribe button, please. Hit the notification bell if you want to get notified of future videos. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me.